They paid just $375 for an abandoned mansion everyone was too afraid to touch, thinking they might flip it for enough to cover next month's medical bills. But when Margaret and Harold opened the hidden vault beneath the library floor, what they found wasn't just forgotten wealth. It was $290 million in cash, stocks, and treasures that would expose why an entire family vanished, why the property sat unclaimed for 43 years, and why sometimes the universe gives second chances to people who've spent a lifetime doing right by others. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind carried the scent of rain across the farmland outside Cedar Springs, Indiana, a town so small it didn't make most maps. Population 3,214, give or take whoever moved away that month. Margaret Davies sat at her kitchen table, reading glasses perched on her nose, surrounded by bills that refused to stop coming. Electricity, water, property tax, and the big one, the one that made her hands shake every time she opened the envelope, medical bills from Harold's surgery 6 months ago. Her husband sat across from her in his worn recliner, the fabric threadbare on the armrests where his hands had rested for 23 years. Harold was 71 now, silver-haired and steady, with the kind of face that had earned trust in every classroom he'd ever taught in. 38 years of high school shop class, teaching teenagers how to use a lathe, how to measure twice and cut once, how to build things that lasted. He'd retired 7 years ago with a modest pension that seemed fine until inflation hit, until his heart decided to act up, until the insurance decided certain procedures weren't quite covered enough. Margaret was 68, sharp as ever despite what her reading glasses suggested. She'd spent 42 years as the head librarian at Cedar Springs Public Library, a building so small it only had 4 aisles, but she'd run it like the Library of Congress. She knew every book, every borrower, every story that mattered in this town. She'd retired 5 years ago thinking they'd have enough, thinking they'd travel, maybe visit their daughter in Oregon, take that trip to see the fall colors in Vermont they'd always talked about. Instead, they were sitting in their small ranch house on Maple Street, trying to figure out which bill to pay first. Margaret pulled off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. The numbers didn't change no matter how many times she looked at them. They were 3 months behind on the property tax, 2 months behind on the credit card they'd used for Harold's medications. The savings account that once held $12,000 now showed $843.17. Harold cleared his throat from across the room. He didn't like talking about money, never had, came from a generation that considered it impolite. But he could see the worry etched into his wife's face, could see the way her shoulders curved inward like she was trying to make herself smaller. "How bad?" he asked quietly. Margaret looked up. Her eyes were blue, still bright, still beautiful to him after 46 years of marriage, but they were tired now in a way he'd never seen before. "We might need to sell the house," she said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Harold didn't respond right away. This house, this tiny 1,200-square-foot ranch with the leaky bathroom faucet and the creaky back door, was where they'd raised their daughter, where they'd hosted Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings, where Margaret had cried when her mother died and where Harold had recovered from his surgery, where their granddaughter had taken her first steps on that worn carpet. "There's got to be another way," Harold finally said. Margaret folded the bills carefully, precisely the way she used to reshelve books. "I've been looking. I applied for 3 part-time jobs. Nobody wants to hire a 68-year-old librarian when they can get a college kid for minimum wage." "I could go back to work," Harold offered. "With your heart?" Margaret shook her head. "Absolutely not." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the neighbor's dog barked. A car drove past. Life continued around them while they tried to figure out how to stay afloat. That's when Margaret saw it. She'd been flipping through the Cedar Springs Gazette the town's weekly newspaper that was more gossip column than journalism. Tucked between an ad for Larry's feed store and a notice about the upcoming county fair was a small announcement: county tax auction, Saturday, October 14th, 10 a.m. Courthouse steps, various properties available, minimum bids starting at $1. Margaret read it twice. She'd heard about these auctions before, properties that had been abandoned, foreclosed, seized for unpaid taxes. Usually they were empty lots or condemned buildings, nothing anyone actually wanted. But she pulled out her phone anyway and searched for the county assessor's website. The list loaded slowly on her old smartphone. She scrolled past vacant lots, past a burned-out gas station, past parcels of land in the middle of nowhere. Then she stopped. Item number 17. The Ashford Estate, 42 acres. Main residence approximately 8,000 square feet. Built 1927. Abandoned since 1982. Starting bid $300. Margaret blinked. She read it again. The Ashford Estate. She knew that name. Everyone in Cedar Springs over a certain age knew that name. Harold, she said slowly. Do you remember the Ashford mansion? Harold looked up from the crossword puzzle he'd been pretending to focus on. The old place out on Cemetery Road, the one everyone says is haunted. It's not haunted, Margaret said, though she wasn't entirely sure. It's just been empty. For 40 years, Harold added. There's a reason nobody goes near it. Margaret stood up and walked to the window. From here she could see 3 houses, all of them smaller than theirs, all of them owned by people barely scraping by, just like them. She thought about the Ashford Estate, about the stories she'd heard over the years. The wealthy family that built it during the Roaring Twenties, the industrialist father who made his fortune in manufacturing, the tragedy that supposedly drove them all away. What if, she said carefully, what if we bought it? Harold set down his crossword. Bought what? The mansion at the auction. The starting bid is $300. Harold laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Maggie, we don't have $300 to waste on a condemned building. It's not condemned, she said, turning to face him. I checked. It's just abandoned. And think about it. 8,000 square feet, 42 acres. Even if the house is falling apart, the land alone has to be worth something. We could flip it, sell it to a developer, maybe make enough to catch up on our bills. Harold studied his wife's face. In 46 years he'd learned to recognize that look. It was the same look she'd had when she'd convinced him to adopt the stray dog that became their daughter's best friend. The same look when she'd organized the fundraiser that saved the library from closing in '98. When Margaret Davies set her mind to something, the world had a way of bending. The auction's on Saturday? He asked. 10 a.m. And you really think we could flip it? Margaret walked back to the table and picked up her phone again. She pulled up photos from the county assessor's website. The images were old, probably from the 80s before the place was abandoned. A sprawling Gothic mansion with stone walls and tall windows. A circular driveway. Massive oak trees framing the entrance. I think, she said slowly, that it's worth looking at. Worst case, we're out $300. Best case, we solve our problems. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked over to his wife, and took her hand. His palms were calloused from 50 years of working with wood and metal. Hers were soft from turning pages. Okay, he said. Let's go to an auction. Saturday morning arrived cold and grey. October in Indiana had a way of reminding you winter was coming whether you were ready or not. Margaret and Harold drove their 1998 Honda Civic into town, the engine making a sound Harold didn't like but couldn't afford to fix. They parked on Main Street across from the courthouse, a red brick building that had stood since 1876. About 30 people had gathered on the courthouse steps. Margaret recognized most of them. Frank Miller, who owned half the rental properties in town. The Davidson brothers, who flipped houses for a living. Sarah Chen, a young lawyer who'd just opened her practice after moving back from Indianapolis. A handful of others, some curious, some serious. The county clerk, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who'd held the position for 22 years, stood at the top of the steps with a clipboard and a portable speaker system that crackled with static. "Morning, folks," Gerald's voice boomed. "We've got 19 properties up for auction today. All sales are final, payment due within 48 hours. Any questions before we start?" Nobody spoke. Margaret felt Harold's hand find hers. Her heart was beating faster than it should. Gerald started with the first property, a vacant lot on the edge of town. Bidding started at $50. Frank Miller got it for $200. Then came a foreclosed duplex. The Davidson brothers went back and forth with another buyer before winning at $8,500. Property after property sold, some quickly, some after tense bidding wars. Margaret watched the pattern. The serious buyers, the professionals, they bid aggressively on anything with clear value. The curious locals bid on small lots and fixer-uppers. Then Gerald reached item 17. "Next up," he announced, "the Ashford Estate, 42 acres out on Cemetery Road, main residence, 8,000 square feet, stone construction, built 1927. Property has been abandoned since 1982, sold as is, starting bid $300. Silence fell over the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered something Margaret couldn't hear. She glanced around. Frank Miller was studying his phone. The Davidson brothers were shaking their heads. Nobody raised a hand. $300, Gerald repeated. "Do I have 300? More silence. Margaret looked at Harold. He looked back at her, eyebrows raised. She could see the question in his eyes. Are we really doing this? She raised her hand. 300 to the lady in the blue jacket, Gerald called out. Do I have 325? Nothing. People turned to look at Margaret like she'd lost her mind. She kept her hand up, trying to look more confident than she felt. 300 going once, Gerald said. Going twice. He paused, scanning the crowd. Sold to bidder 47 for $300. Just like that, they owned a mansion. The drive out to Cemetery Road took 15 minutes. Harold drove slowly, following the directions on Margaret's phone. They passed the Walmart on the edge of town, then the cluster of fast food restaurants, then farmland stretching flat and endless under the grey sky. Cemetery Road wasn't actually near a cemetery anymore. The old graves had been moved in the 50s when they built the highway, but the name stuck. The road was narrow, cracked asphalt bordered by drainage ditches and overgrown fields. They passed one farmhouse, then another, both at least a mile apart. Should be coming up on the right, Margaret said, watching her phone's GPS. Then she saw it. A gap in the trees, an opening that might have once been a grand entrance. 2 stone pillars stood on either side, crumbling at the edges, covered in ivy. Between them, a driveway disappeared into darkness. Harold turned in slowly. The Civic suspension complained as they rolled over potholes and roots that had broken through the asphalt. Branches scraped against the windows. The driveway curved, following the natural slope of the land, trees pressing in from both sides. Then the trees opened up, and the mansion appeared. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It was massive. 3 stories of grey stone with tall windows that reflected the cloudy sky like dead eyes. A tower rose from one corner, topped with a wrought iron weather vane that had frozen pointing northeast. The roof was slate, mostly intact except for a few missing tiles. Ivy climbed the walls, so thick in places it obscured the stone completely. The circular driveway wrapped around a dry fountain. Weeds grew through the cracks. The front entrance featured double oak doors, easily 10 feet tall, beneath a stone archway carved with decorative scrollwork. Harold parked the Civic and they sat for a moment, just staring. "Well," he finally said, "we definitely bought something." They got out of the car. The air smelled like decay and old earth. The wind moved through the empty windows, creating a low whistle that sounded almost like breathing. Margaret pulled her jacket tighter. "I brought a flashlight," Harold said, retrieving it from the trunk, "and my toolbox, in case we need to pry anything open." They approached the front doors together. Margaret expected them to be locked, but when Harold pushed, they swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty house. Inside, darkness waited. Harold clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a grand foyer that took Margaret's breath away. Despite 41 years of abandonment, it was remarkably intact. A curved staircase swept up to the second floor, the banister still polished beneath a layer of dust. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, probably worth thousands, missing only a few crystals. The floor was marble, black and white tiles in a checkerboard pattern. Along the walls, portraits hung in heavy frames, faces from another era, stern and formal, staring down at the intruders. "Good Lord," Margaret whispered. Her voice echoed. They moved deeper into the house. The flashlight revealed room after room, each more impressive than the last. A formal dining room with a table that could seat 20. A parlor with furniture still covered in white sheets. A library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the spines of thousands of books still visible in the flashlight's beam. "Why would anyone abandon this?" Harold asked. Margaret didn't answer. She was thinking about what she'd heard over the years. Stories passed down at the library, whispered over coffee at the diner, the Ashford family tragedy, the father who'd lost his wife and son, the way he'd withdrawn from the world. In the library, Margaret stopped. Something felt different here. The room was more carefully preserved than the others. The books were organized, dusted. A large oak desk sat in the center, facing windows that overlooked the overgrown gardens. On the desk, papers lay scattered as if someone had just stepped away. Harold moved the flashlight across the walls. That's when Margaret saw it. "Harold, shine the light there, on that panel." He directed the beam where she pointed. Most of the library walls were covered in bookshelves, dark wood carved with intricate detail, but one section, behind the desk, looked different. The wood grain didn't quite match, the shelves appeared shallower. Margaret walked over and ran her fingers along the edge. She felt a seam, almost invisible, running vertically along one side. "This isn't right," she said. Harold came closer. He examined the panel, his shop teacher's eye catching what Margaret's librarian intuition had sensed. "It's a false wall. See how the trim pieces don't line up?" They both stood there staring at the hidden seam. Margaret's heart was pounding again. She thought about all the mystery novels she'd catalogued over the years, all the stories about secret passages and hidden rooms. "We should open it," she said. "Should we?" Harold asked. "I mean, this is someone's house, someone's things." "We own it now," Margaret reminded him. "We paid for it. Whatever's here, it's legally ours." Harold couldn't argue with that logic. He set down the flashlight and pulled out a small pry bar from his toolbox. Carefully, he worked it into the seam. The wood was old but solid. It took effort, but eventually something clicked. The panel swung outward on hidden hinges. Behind it was a safe, old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in a black-and-white movie. It was built into the wall, made of heavy steel painted black. In the center, a combination dial gleamed dully in the flashlight beam. Margaret and Harold looked at each other. "Well," Margaret said, "that's interesting." They spent the next hour exploring the rest of the mansion. Every room revealed more questions. In the master bedroom, clothes still hung in the closet, suits from the 70s and 80s perfectly preserved. The kitchen looked frozen in time, with pots hanging from hooks and dishes in the cabinets. Upstairs bedrooms were furnished and waiting, as if the owners had simply walked out one day and never returned. But it was the basement that truly unnerved them. Harold found the door off the kitchen, a heavy wooden panel that opened to reveal stone steps descending into darkness. The air that rose up was cold and dry, not musty like they'd expected. They descended carefully, Harold in the lead with the flashlight. The basement was massive, running the entire length of the house. But it wasn't just storage. It was organized, almost clinical. Metal shelving units lined the walls, floor to ceiling. On them, items were carefully arranged and covered. Margaret pulled back one cover and gasped. Underneath was a painting, a genuine oil painting in a gilded frame. Even to her untrained eye, it looked valuable. Harold was checking other shelves. "Maggie, come look at this." She joined him. He'd uncovered a section that held books, but not ordinary books. These were leather-bound first editions, the kind she'd only ever seen behind glass in university libraries. Beside them, cases of coins, boxes labeled with careful handwriting, sterling silver, 1876, porcelain, Ming Dynasty, crystal, Baccarat, 1923. "This isn't just storage," Margaret breathed. "This is a collection. Someone was preserving all this." They found filing cabinets next, 4 of them lined up against the back wall. Margaret opened the first drawer. Inside were folders, meticulously organized. Inventory lists, appraisals, photographs, receipts going back decades. Harold pulled out one folder labeled Estate Summary. Inside was a typed document, yellowed with age but perfectly legible. Margaret held the flashlight while Harold read aloud. Ashford Family Collection, compiled by James Ashford, begun 1953, last updated March 1982. Harold flipped pages. It lists everything: paintings, sculptures, rare books, coin collections, jewelry, antique furniture, precious metals. He stopped, his finger on a line at the bottom of the page. Estimated total value as of March 1982, $4,200,000. Margaret did the math in her head. That was 41 years ago. With inflation, appreciation, that could be worth a lot more now, Harold finished. They stood in the darkness of that basement, surrounded by treasures nobody had claimed, nobody had even looked for, in over 4 decades. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in Harold's hand. "We need to go home," Margaret said quietly. "We need to think about this, and we need to be very, very careful who we tell." The drive back to their small house on Maple Street was silent. Both of them were processing what they'd seen, what they'd found, what it might mean. Harold's mind was full of questions about the Ashford family, about how all of this had been left behind. Margaret's librarian instincts were screaming at her to research, to find records, to understand the history. When they pulled into their driveway, the house looked even smaller than usual. Margaret thought about the mansion, about rooms bigger than their entire home, about treasures hidden in the basement worth more than everything on Maple Street combined. Inside, Harold made coffee while Margaret sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. She started searching. James Ashford, Cedar Springs, Indiana. The results came slowly, but they came. James Ashford, born 1905, died. The record ended. No death certificate on file. She found an old society page from the Indianapolis Star, dated 1931. A photograph of a wedding. James Ashford and Catherine Monroe. Margaret studied the image, grainy and formal. James was tall, serious-looking, with dark hair and intense eyes. Catherine was beautiful, with a shy smile and flowers in her hair. More searching revealed their son, Thomas Ashford, born 1938. Then the trail went cold. Nothing after 1976. Margaret dug deeper, using skills she'd developed over decades of helping library patrons with genealogy research. She found Thomas Ashford's name on a memorial wall. Vietnam Veterans, Killed in Action, 1968. Her chest tightened. A son lost in the war. She kept searching. Catherine Ashford, obituary, Cedar Springs Gazette, October 1970. Died peacefully at home, survived by husband James. So James had lost his son in 68, lost his wife in 70. And then Harold set a mug of coffee beside her. "Finding anything?" "The Ashford family," Margaret said slowly. "They lost their son in Vietnam. The mother died 2 years later, probably from grief. And James, the father, he lived in that mansion alone for 12 more years. Then he just vanished. No death record, no will filed. Nothing." "People don't just vanish," Harold said. "They do if they want to," Margaret replied, "especially if they're old, alone, and tired of the world." She clicked through more results. The last mention she could find of James Ashford was from the Cedar Springs Gazette, March 1982. A brief mention in the police blotter: "Welfare check requested at Ashford Estate, Cemetery Road. No contact made. Premises secure." After that, nothing. The property had been seized for unpaid taxes in 1987. It had sat in legal limbo for 35 years, waiting for someone to claim it. But nobody ever did. Margaret closed her laptop and picked up her coffee mug. The warmth felt good in her cold hands. "There's something else," she said. "The safe in the library. It must have something in it, something important enough to hide behind a false wall." Harold sat down across from her. "We can't open it, not without the combination. We could hire someone, a locksmith, who we trust not to ask questions." Harold shook his head. "Maggie, think about this. We just bought a mansion for $375. Inside it, we found what might be millions of dollars worth of art and collectibles, if word gets out." He didn't need to finish. They both knew what would happen. Distant relatives would appear, lawyers would get involved, the county might claim it. The IRS would have questions. Their quiet attempt to solve their financial problems would become a circus. Margaret set down her mug and reached across the table to take Harold's hand. "So what do we do?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car drove past. The refrigerator hummed, normal sounds in their normal life that might not be normal much longer. "We do what we always do," he finally said. "We think it through. We're careful. We don't rush." He squeezed her hand. "And we figure out what James Ashford wanted. Because whatever's in that safe, whatever he left behind, there's a reason he didn't destroy it or sell it or give it away." Margaret nodded. She thought about the basement full of treasures, carefully preserved and catalogued. She thought about the library, untouched and waiting. She thought about a lonely man who'd lost everyone he loved and spent his final years collecting beautiful things, organizing them, saving them. For what? For who? "We need to go back tomorrow," she said. "We need to see everything in the daylight, take photos, make a full inventory." "Agreed," Harold said. "But we tell no one. Not yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed next to Harold, listening to his steady breathing, thinking about the mansion on Cemetery Road, about the safe behind the false wall, about James Ashford alone in that big house, waiting for something or someone who never came. She thought about their own situation, the bills piled on the kitchen table, the house they might have to sell, the future that seemed to be narrowing with each passing year. And she thought about the words Harold had read in the basement. Estimated total value, $4,200,000, 41 years ago. What would it be worth now? 10 million? 20? More? Enough to change everything. Enough to solve every problem they had. Enough to live comfortably, to help their daughter, to finally take that trip to Vermont. But also enough to destroy them if they weren't careful, enough to bring out the worst in people, enough to turn their quiet lives into a nightmare. Margaret rolled over and looked at the clock. 2:17 a.m. She closed her eyes and tried to quiet her racing thoughts. Tomorrow they'd go back. Tomorrow they'd see it all again in the daylight. Tomorrow they'd start figuring out what to do with a $375 mansion that held secrets worth a fortune. Tomorrow their real journey would begin. And somewhere out on Cemetery Road, the Ashford estate sat in darkness, windows like empty eyes, keeping its secrets for one more night, keeping them safe, waiting for Margaret and Harold to return, waiting to reveal the full truth of what James Ashford had left behind, waiting to test whether two ordinary people, faced with extraordinary wealth, would choose greed or something greater. The wind moved through the empty rooms, the ivy rustled against the stone walls, and in the library, behind the false panel, the safe waited in silence, holding the answer to a question Margaret and Harold hadn't yet learned to ask. Sunday morning broke clear and cold. Margaret was up before dawn, already dressed, coffee brewing in the kitchen. Harold found her at the table with a notebook, writing a list in her careful librarian's handwriting. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Kept thinking about that basement," she admitted. "About all those filing cabinets. There's a system there, Harold. James Ashford documented everything. If we're going to understand what we found, we need to go through those files." Harold poured himself coffee and sat down beside her. "I've been thinking too, about the safe. We need to open it, but you're right about trust. I think I know someone." Margaret looked up. "Who?" "Sarah Chen, the lawyer from the auction. She's young, but she's got a good reputation. And she's not from here originally. No connections to Old Town gossip." Margaret considered this. Sarah had moved back to Cedar Springs 2 years ago after working at a big firm in Indianapolis. Opened her own practice handling real estate, wills, estate planning. Margaret had seen her at the library a few times, always polite, always professional. "We'd have to tell her what we found," Margaret said. "We'd have to tell someone eventually," Harold replied. "Better someone bound by attorney-client privilege." They arrived at the mansion just after 8. In daylight, it looked different. Less ominous, more tragic. Margaret could see the bones of what had once been beautiful gardens, overgrown hedges that had been shaped into geometric patterns, a stone path leading to what might have been a rose garden. Everything choked by 41 years of neglect. Inside, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The grand foyer looked almost magical, the crystal chandelier casting rainbow prisms across the marble floor. They spent the morning methodically going through the first floor, taking photos with Margaret's phone, making notes. In the formal dining room, they found a china cabinet filled with dishes so fine Margaret was afraid to touch them. Each plate was rimmed in gold, painted with delicate floral patterns. The parlor held furniture that belonged in a museum, a settee upholstered in burgundy velvet, chairs with carved legs, side tables inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Everything covered in sheets but perfectly preserved beneath. Harold was examining a grandfather clock in the hallway when he called out, "Maggie, come look at this." She found him pointing to a small engraved plate on the clock's base, manufactured by J. Ainsley, London, 1843. "This thing is over 180 years old," Harold said quietly, "and it's in perfect condition." They moved upstairs. The master bedroom was painful to see. The bed was still made, the spread pulled tight with hospital corners. Men's clothing hung in the closet. Suits from the 70s with wide lapels, dress shirts still in their dry cleaning plastic. On the nightstand, a photograph in a silver frame, James and Catherine Ashford on their wedding day, the same image Margaret had found online but clearer, more personal. Beside it, another photo, a young man in military uniform, Thomas, their son. He had his mother's eyes and his father's serious expression. Margaret picked up the frame carefully. On the back, someone had written, "Tommy, 1967, before deployment." Her throat tightened. This boy had never come home, and his parents had kept his photo beside their bed, looking at it every night, every morning, until there was only one parent left, then none. She set the frame down gently, and they continued searching. What they found told a story of a man who'd stopped living but couldn't quite let go. The calendar on the desk in what must have been James's study was frozen on March 1982, The last notation, written in shaky handwriting, said simply, "Finished." Finished what? Margaret wondered. They returned to the library with purpose. This room was clearly where James had spent most of his time. The desk was covered in papers, ledgers, correspondence. Margaret began sorting through them while Harold examined the bookshelves. "These aren't just any books," Harold said, pulling one down carefully. "Look at this. First edition Hemingway, and this one, Fitzgerald. The spine alone probably costs more than our car." Margaret was reading a letter, yellowed and brittle. It was addressed to James Ashford from a gallery in New York City, dated June 1978. "Dear Mr. Ashford, we are pleased to inform you that the Degas we acquired on your behalf has been authenticated. The provenance is impeccable. As discussed, we will hold it in our climate-controlled vault until you are ready for delivery." She shuffled through more papers. Appraisals, auction receipts, correspondence with dealers in London, Paris, Hong Kong. James Ashford hadn't just collected randomly. He'd been deliberate, methodical, working with experts around the world. But why? Why spend a fortune collecting art and antiques only to hide them in a basement? Harold had moved to the false wall panel they'd discovered yesterday. In daylight, the seam was more visible. He examined the safe again, running his fingers around its edges. "This is a Mosler," he said. "Top of the line for its era. The combination is probably 6 numbers. Without it, we'd need a professional safecracker." "Or we find the combination," Margaret said. She was looking at the desk again, at the papers scattered across it. Harold, James documented everything, inventory lists, appraisals, receipts. He was meticulous. Would someone that careful not write down a safe combination? They began searching in earnest. Desk drawers yielded more papers, old checkbooks, bank statements. A humidor filled with cigars dried to dust. A drawer of fountain pens, each one probably worth hundreds. Margaret was about to give up when she found it, tucked inside a leather-bound journal, a small card. On it, written in the same shaky handwriting as the calendar notation, 6 numbers, 271938. Her heart started pounding. "Harold?" He came over immediately. She showed him the card. "That could be anything," he said. "A phone number, a date." "Or a combination," Margaret replied. 271938. Harold, when was Thomas born? He understood immediately. They'd seen it in their research. Thomas Ashford, born July 27th, 1938. Month, day, year. 271938. Margaret's hands were shaking as she approached the safe. Harold stood beside her, close enough that she could hear his breathing. She reached out and touched the dial, cool metal under her fingertips. Slowly, carefully, she turned it. Right to 2, left past 2 to 7, right to 1, left to 9, right to 3, left to 8. Something inside clicked. She grabbed the handle and pulled. The heavy door swung open with a soft groan. Inside, the safe was divided into sections. The top shelf held bundles of papers wrapped in string. The middle shelf had several small boxes. The bottom held a larger metal box, like a document safe. Margaret reached for the bundles first, untied the string. Inside were letters, dozens of them, handwritten on fine stationery. She unfolded the first one carefully. "To whoever finds this," it began. "My name is James Robert Ashford. I am writing this in March of 1982. I am 77 years old, alone and tired, but I am not ready to let go of everything I have built." Margaret's voice cracked as she read aloud. Harold moved closer, reading over her shoulder. "My son Thomas died in Vietnam in 1968. He was 30 years old. He wanted to be an architect. He died in a rice paddy 9,000 miles from home, shot by someone who had never met him, fighting in a war nobody could explain. My wife Catherine died 2 years later. The doctors said it was her heart, but I knew better. She died of grief, of a broken heart that finally just stopped beating." Margaret had to pause, blinking back tears. I spent the next 12 years collecting paintings, books, antiques, anything beautiful, anything that lasted. I told myself I was preserving culture, protecting valuable pieces from a world that didn't care. But the truth is simpler and sadder. I was trying to hold on to something, trying to build a legacy when my real legacy, my son, was buried in Arlington. Harold's hand found Margaret's shoulder. I have no family left. Catherine's sister died in 74. My brother passed in 79. There are distant cousins somewhere, people I have never met, people who never visited when Catherine was alive, who never wrote when Thomas died. I will not leave my life's work to strangers who measure worth in dollars. What happens next will change everything for Margaret and Harold, reveal the true magnitude of what they've discovered, and test whether two honest people can protect a fortune from those who would exploit it. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. I have been approached, the letter continued, by dealers, by museums, by collectors who somehow learned what I have here. They want to buy pieces, they offer tremendous sums, but they see only objects, only investments. They do not see what these things represent: beauty, craftsmanship, the effort of human hands to create something that transcends mortality. Margaret turned to the next page. So I have hidden everything, catalogued it, preserved it, and sealed it away. The house itself will eventually be seized for taxes, I imagine. I have stopped paying them, stopped paying anything. The state can have the building, but what lies beneath, in the vault I had built in 1955, that is for someone else. Someone who finds it not through greed, but through need. Someone who stumbles upon it the way Catherine and I stumbled upon each other at a church social in 1931. Harold cleared his throat. There's more. Keep reading. If you are reading this, you have found the first safe. You have been clever enough or lucky enough to open it. But this is only the beginning. In the basement, behind the wine cellar on the east wall, there is another door. It requires a key. Margaret reached into the safe and pulled out a small brass key that had been sitting beside the letters. This key. What lies beyond that door is the true collection. What you have seen so far is merely the overflow, the pieces I ran out of room for in the vault proper. Margaret and Harold looked at each other, eyes wide. The vault contains my most precious acquisitions, rare coins worth millions, first edition books signed by their authors, paintings by masters, stock certificates I purchased decades ago and never sold, companies that have grown beyond anything I imagined, precious metals, jewelry that belonged to Catherine, to my mother, pieces collected over 3 generations, and cash. A great deal of cash. I did not trust banks after the Depression. I kept much of my wealth in physical form, secured and waiting. Margaret's hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold the letter. I have left instructions in the smaller box in this safe, legal documents, a letter to be filed with the county if you choose to claim everything properly. I have done my best to make this legitimate, to ensure that whoever finds this has a legal right to it all. I purchased this property in my name with no liens, no debts. When it is seized for taxes and auctioned, whoever buys it buys everything in it, seen and unseen. Harold pulled out the smaller box Margaret had noticed. Inside were legal documents, carefully organized. A deed to the property, transfer papers, something that looked like a letter of intent, notarized and dated March 15th, 1982. Margaret read the legal document aloud. I, James Robert Ashford, being of sound mind, do hereby state that all contents of the Ashford estate, including but not limited to items stored in sealed vaults, safes, and hidden chambers, are to be considered fixtures of the property itself and transfer with the sale of said property to any future owner. He planned this, Harold said, his voice full of wonder. He set it up so whoever bought the house legally owned everything in it. Margaret returned to the letter, reading the final paragraphs. I do not know who you are. I do not know when you will find this. It may be months from now or decades. But I ask only this: do not let greed consume you. What I have collected has value, yes, but it also has meaning. These objects outlasted their creators. They will outlast me. They will outlast you. Treat them with respect, and if you choose to sell them, to liquidate everything for money, at least let some good come of it. Help others the way I wish I could have helped my son. The letter was signed in that shaky handwriting. James Robert Ashford, March 18, 1982. Margaret folded it carefully and set it down. Her cheeks were wet with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. Harold was wiping his eyes too. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Harold picked up the brass key. "We need to see the vault," he said. They descended to the basement again, the key clutched in Harold's hand. The wine cellar was in the eastern corner, exactly as James had described. It was smaller than the main basement area, with stone walls and wooden racks that had once held bottles. Most were empty now, though a few dusty bottles remained. Harold examined the east wall carefully. At first, it looked like solid stone, but when he pressed on certain blocks, he felt them give slightly. He worked his fingers into a gap and pulled. A section of the wall swung outward, revealing a steel door behind it. The door was industrial grade, the kind you'd see on a bank vault. In the center was a keyhole. Harold inserted the brass key. It turned smoothly, as if it had been oiled recently, though that was impossible. The door opened with a heavy click. Beyond was darkness. Harold reached around the frame and found a light switch. When he flipped it, fluorescent lights flickered to life. Margaret gasped. The vault was the size of a 3-car garage, with walls lined in cedar and climate control systems still humming. The air was cool and dry, perfectly preserved. And everywhere, on shelves, in glass cases, hanging on walls, was wealth beyond comprehension. They stepped inside slowly, reverently, like entering a cathedral. To the left, display cases held coins. Ancient Roman coins, gold doubloons, rare American coins in pristine condition. Each case was labeled with careful notations: year, mint, grade, estimated value. Along the back wall, paintings hung in climate-controlled frames. Margaret recognized some from her years of reading: a Monet, a Degas, a Cassatt, a Winslow Homer. Others she didn't know but could tell were significant by the way they commanded attention. Shelving units held books protected in archival boxes. Harold opened one carefully. Inside was a first edition of Moby Dick, signed by Herman Melville. Another held the complete works of Shakespeare, dating to 1623. Glass cabinets contained jewelry, necklaces dripping with diamonds, brooches of emerald and sapphire, rings that caught the light like trapped stars. A placard indicated these had belonged to Catherine Ashford and her mother before her. In the center of the room stood a large table. On it, organized in labeled boxes, were stock certificates. Harold picked one up carefully. General Electric, purchased 1962. The certificate was for 1,000 shares at $43 per share. He did quick math in his head. With stock splits over 60 years, those shares would now be worth, he couldn't even calculate it. There were more. IBM, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble. Dozens of blue-chip companies, stocks purchased decades ago and never sold, growing quietly in the darkness. And in the corner, in a floor safe that stood open, were stacks of currency. Not modern bills, but older ones, bundled and organized by denomination. Margaret picked up one bundle. 50 $100 bills bound with a paper band stamped with a bank name from 1978. She counted the bundles visible in the safe, at least 200. That was $1 million in just what she could see, and the safe had multiple shelves. Harold had found the inventory ledger, a massive book resting on a podium near the door. He opened it to the last page, where James Ashford had made his final entry. Vault Contents, Final Inventory, March 1982, Harold read. Paintings, 47 pieces, estimated value $2,800,000. Rare books, 312 volumes, estimated value $1,500,000. Jewelry, estimated value $800,000. Coin collection, estimated value $3,200,000. Stock certificates, current paper value approximately $23 million. He paused, his finger moving down the page. Precious metals, gold and silver bullion, estimated value $4 million. Currency in safe, $1,400,000. Miscellaneous antiques and collectibles, estimated value $1,100,000. Harold's voice dropped to a whisper as he read the total. Combined estimated value as of March 1982, $37,800,000. Margaret sat down hard on a nearby chair. Her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. "Harold," she said, "that was 41 years ago." He nodded slowly. "The stocks alone, General Electric in 1962. That stock has split multiple times, same with the others, and the art. Monet paintings that were worth $50,000 in '82 are worth millions now." They looked around the vault with new eyes. Every painting, every book, every coin, every stock certificate. 41 years of appreciation, 41 years of growth, 41 years of compound interest on investments James Ashford had made when color television was new and gasoline cost 33 cents a gallon. Margaret stood on shaking legs and walked to the painting hanging nearest to her. The Monet, a water lily scene, soft blues and greens. Beside it, a small card in James's handwriting. Purchased 1968, private sale, authenticated by Anderson Gallery, New York. She pulled out her phone and searched. Monet water lilies painting value. The results made her dizzy. A similar Monet had sold at auction 2 years ago for $41 million. One painting, $41 million. Harold was beside her now, looking at the same screen. "Maggie," he said quietly, "how much do you think all of this is worth now?" She thought about the stocks that had split and grown, the art that had appreciated beyond anyone's imagination, the gold that had increased tenfold in value, the rare coins that had become even rarer, the books that were now museum pieces. "I don't know," she whispered. "Hundreds of millions." They spent the next 2 hours carefully photographing everything, every painting, every display case, every page of the inventory ledger. Margaret's phone ran out of storage, so they used Harold's. The sheer volume of wealth was overwhelming. In a cabinet near the back, Margaret found something that made her stop. A small wooden box separate from everything else. Inside were personal items. Catherine's wedding ring. A locket containing a photo of baby Thomas. A silver medal, maybe from Thomas's school days. A program from his high school graduation. And a folded flag, the kind given to families of fallen soldiers. These weren't valuables. These were memories. Treasures of a different kind. Margaret closed the box carefully and set it back where she'd found it. By early afternoon, they'd documented everything they could. Harold locked the vault, replaced the stone wall section, and they climbed back upstairs. In the library, they sat at James Ashford's desk, surrounded by papers and the weight of what they'd discovered. "We need help," Margaret said. "This is beyond us." Harold nodded. "Sarah Chen, tomorrow morning." That night, Margaret couldn't eat dinner. She pushed food around her plate while Harold pretended to watch television. Both of them were thinking the same things, asking the same questions. They'd bought a property for $375. Inside it, they'd found a fortune that could be worth $200 million. Maybe more. Maybe much more. It was legal. James Ashford had set it up to be legal. The documents in the safe proved it. Whoever bought the property owned its contents. They'd bought it at a legitimate auction. They had receipts, title transfer papers, everything. But legal and safe were different things. Margaret thought about what would happen when word got out. Because it would get out eventually. They couldn't just start selling Monet paintings without people noticing. They couldn't cash in 41-year-old stock certificates without questions being asked. People would come. Reporters, lawyers, distant Ashford relatives they'd never heard of, the IRS, the county, maybe the federal government. Their quiet life would explode. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked Harold. He looked up from the television he wasn't watching. "What do you mean?" "Keeping it. All of it. James Ashford left it for whoever found it, but did he mean for someone to keep everything? All those millions?" Harold was quiet for a long time. He wrote that letter. He said not to let greed consume us, to let some good come of it. Margaret nodded. She'd been thinking about that line, let some good come of it. They had medical bills, property taxes, credit card debt, maybe $50,000 in total problems. And they'd found a solution worth hundreds of millions. The math didn't make sense. The universe didn't work that way. "We'll talk to Sarah tomorrow," Harold said. "We'll be smart about this. But Maggie, we earned this. We took a chance. We bought that property when everyone else was too scared. We found what James hid, and according to his own words, he wanted it to go to someone who found it through need, not greed. That's us." Margaret wanted to believe him, wanted to believe they deserved even a fraction of what they'd found. But she kept thinking about James Ashford, alone in that mansion, collecting beautiful things to fill the hole where his family used to be. She kept thinking about Thomas, who never got to become an architect, about Catherine, who died of a broken heart, about how money, even hundreds of millions of dollars, couldn't fix some things. She went to bed but didn't sleep. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and thought about tomorrow, about Sarah Chen, about what happened next, about the moment their secret became real, when they'd have to decide not just whether to keep the fortune, but what kind of people they wanted to be. Because James Ashford was right about one thing: these objects would outlast them all. The paintings, the books, the coins. They'd been here before Margaret and Harold were born. They'd be here long after both of them were gone. The question wasn't whether they deserved the fortune. The question was what they'd do with it. And that answer, Margaret realized as the night deepened around her, would define everything that came next. Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere in the darkness, the Ashford mansion stood waiting, its vault full of treasures, its secrets no longer secret, its future now in the hands of two people who'd bought it for less than the price of a used refrigerator and found inside it the answer to every prayer they'd ever whispered and questions they hadn't known to ask. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight, they were still just Margaret and Harold Davies, living on Maple Street, trying to figure out how to pay their bills and keep their heads above water. Tomorrow, they'd become something else entirely, something they weren't sure they were ready for. But ready or not, the vault was open. The truth was known, and there was no going back to who they'd been before they'd turned that key. Monday morning came too fast. Margaret was up at 5, showered, dressed in her most professional outfit, a navy blazer she'd worn to library board meetings and Harold's retirement dinner. Harold put on his one good suit, the one he wore to weddings and funerals, and they drove to Sarah Chen's office on Main Street. Sarah's practice occupied the second floor above the hardware store, a modest space with a waiting area, a small conference room, and her private office. She greeted them at the door herself, professional but warm, her dark hair pulled back, wearing a grey pantsuit that made Margaret feel slightly underdressed. "Mr. and Mrs. Davies," she said, shaking their hands. "You said on the phone this was urgent." "It is," Margaret replied, "and we need to know that everything we tell you is confidential." Sarah's expression grew serious. "Attorney-client privilege. Anything you tell me stays between us unless you give me permission otherwise." She led them into the conference room and closed the door. "What's this about?" Margaret and Harold exchanged a look. Then Margaret pulled out her phone and set it on the table. She'd spent the previous evening organizing the photos they'd taken. Hundreds of them. "We bought the Ashford estate," she began, At the auction Saturday, we paid $375. Sarah nodded. I remember. I was surprised no one else bid. That's a significant property. We found something inside, Harold said. Multiple things, actually. Margaret started scrolling through photos. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes widening as image after image appeared. Paintings, coins, stock certificates, the vault itself, shelves full of treasures. My God, Sarah whispered. Is this real? Very real, Margaret said. She pulled out the folder they'd brought, containing copies of James Ashford's letter, the legal documents from the safe, and the inventory ledger pages they'd photographed. James Ashford, the original owner, he documented everything, and he wrote this. Sarah read the letter in silence. When she finished, she set it down carefully and looked at Margaret and Harold with an expression that was part shock, part concern. Do you understand what you're sitting on? She asked. We think so, Harold replied. That's why we're here. We need to know if it's really ours, legally. Sarah picked up the deed and the letter of intent, studying them carefully. She was quiet for several minutes, her lawyer's mind working through the implications. Okay, she finally said. Let me think through this step by step. You purchased the property at a legitimate county tax auction. You have the deed. You paid in full. She looked up. The property had been seized for unpaid taxes and sat in legal limbo for 35 years with no heirs coming forward to claim it. Right, Margaret confirmed. James Ashford's letter of intent, if it holds up, states that all contents of the property are fixtures that transfer with the sale. That's unusual but not illegal. It's similar to a house sale where the previous owner leaves furniture or appliances. Sarah paused. But this isn't furniture. This is potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. We estimated closer to $290 million, Harold said quietly, based on current market values for similar pieces. Sarah's face went pale. She set down the papers and folded her hands on the table. You need to understand what's going to happen when this becomes public knowledge, because it will become public. You can't liquidate assets of this magnitude without it getting out. We know, Margaret said. That's why we came to you first. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at Main Street. A few people were walking to the diner for breakfast. The hardware store below was just opening. Normal small-town life continuing, unaware that two of its residents had just become potentially wealthier than everyone in Cedar Springs combined. Here's what I see coming, Sarah said, turning back to them. First, the IRS. They'll want to know about any assets you sell and they'll want their cut. Capital gains tax on anything you liquidate. Possibly estate tax implications, though James Ashford's letter might protect you there. What else? Harold asked. Distant relatives. You said James had no immediate family, but there are always cousins, second cousins, people you've never heard of who will come out of the woodwork claiming they're entitled to a share. They'll hire lawyers. Some of those claims might have merit. Margaret's stomach tightened. The county might argue they're owed more than the $375 you paid. They could claim the auction was invalid because the true value of the property wasn't properly assessed. It's a weak argument, but they might try. Sarah returned to her seat. And then there's public opinion. Cedar Springs is a small town. People will have thoughts about two people becoming multimillionaires overnight. Some will be happy for you. Others will be jealous. Some will think you cheated somehow. We didn't cheat, Harold said firmly. I know that. But perception and reality are different things. Sarah opened her laptop. I need to research similar cases. Property sales where hidden assets were discovered. There's legal precedent, but every situation is unique, and I need to be honest with you. This is beyond my expertise. You're going to need specialists, tax attorneys, estate lawyers, maybe even art experts to properly appraise everything. But you'll help us? Margaret asked. Sarah looked at them both, these two elderly people who'd come to her in their Sunday best, asking for help navigating something that would terrify most lawyers. "Yes," she said, "I'll help you, but we need to be strategic. We need to move carefully, and we need to be prepared for this to get complicated." It got complicated faster than any of them expected. By Wednesday, word had started to leak. Margaret wasn't sure how. Maybe someone at the county office mentioned the Ashford estate had finally sold. Maybe a neighbour had seen them driving out to Cemetery Road. Small towns had a way of knowing things. She was at the grocery store when she first felt it. The stares, the whispers. 2 women in the produce section stopped talking when she walked past. The cashier, usually chatty, was oddly quiet while ringing up her items. Harold experienced it at the hardware store. He went in for light bulbs, and the owner, Frank, who'd known Harold for 30 years, asked pointed questions. "Heard you bought the old Ashford place. What are you planning to do with it? You find anything interesting out there?" By Friday, Sarah called them in for another meeting. "We have a problem," she said, sliding a business card across the table. 3 different law firms called me yesterday, all of them representing people claiming to be Ashford descendants. They want to discuss settlement." "Settlement for what?" Harold asked. "We haven't done anything." "They're claiming James Ashford's letter isn't legally binding. That community property laws mean the estate should have been probated, not sold at auction. They want a percentage of anything you found." Margaret felt anger rising in her chest. These people, did any of them visit James when he was alive? Did any of them come to Catherine's funeral, to Thomas's memorial? "That's not really the point from a legal standpoint," Sarah said gently. "If they can prove relation and argue the property transfer wasn't proper, they might have a case." "Might," Harold emphasized. "You said might." "Yes, I've been researching. The auction was legitimate. The property had been abandoned for over 4 decades. No one filed claims during that time. James's letter, while unusual, appears to have been properly notarized. We have a strong position." Sarah paused. "But fighting it will cost money, possibly a lot of money, and it will definitely attract attention." That night, the attention arrived in the form of a news van. Channel 7 from Indianapolis. Someone had tipped them off. Margaret watched from behind the curtains as a reporter stood in front of their house, camera pointed at their front door, talking into a microphone. Harold called Sarah immediately. "There's a news crew outside." "Don't talk to them," Sarah said. "Don't say anything. I'll handle it." But the news story ran anyway. Margaret and Harold watched it on the 11 o'clock broadcast, feeling surreal as the reporter explained that a local couple had purchased an abandoned mansion and allegedly found millions in hidden treasures inside. The report was vague on details but heavy on speculation. The reporter interviewed Frank from the hardware store. "They've been struggling financially like a lot of folks around here. Then suddenly they buy this mansion. Seems suspicious to me." Another neighbor, someone Margaret barely knew, said, "I always wondered what was in that old place. If there's really millions hidden there, shouldn't it belong to the town, to the county, not just 2 random people?" Margaret turned off the television. Harold sat beside her on the couch, both of them silent. "This is only going to get worse," she finally said. Harold took her hand. "Sarah will protect us. We'll get through this." But Margaret wasn't sure. She thought about James Ashford's letter, about his warning not to let greed consume them. She wondered if he'd known this would happen, if he'd experienced something similar when he was alive, people wanting what he had, demanding a piece of his success. The weekend brought more complications. On Saturday morning, Margaret found a letter slipped under their door. No stamp, hand-delivered. Inside was a typed note. "You don't deserve what you found. People in this town are struggling and you're sitting on millions. Do the right thing." It wasn't signed. Harold wanted to call the police, but Margaret stopped him. "And tell them what? Someone left us an angry letter? They won't do anything." More letters came over the next few days, some angry, some pleading. One from a single mother asking if they could help with her daughter's medical bills. Another from a veteran requesting money to save his farm from foreclosure. Each letter made Margaret's chest tighter. On Tuesday, Sarah called with worse news. The county is filing a motion to halt any sale or transfer of assets from the Ashford estate pending a full investigation. They're claiming improper valuation of the property affected the auction's legitimacy. Can they do that? Harold asked. They were on speakerphone in Sarah's office. They can try. It's politically motivated. The county commissioners are getting pressure. People are asking why a property with millions inside was sold for $375. They want answers. The answer is that nobody knew what was inside, Margaret said, including us. I know that, but we're going to have to prove it. Sarah sighed. I'm filing a response. We're going to fight this, but I need you both to be prepared for this to take time. Months, possibly longer. Margaret and Harold left Sarah's office in silence. They drove home, but instead of going inside, Harold kept driving. Out of town, past the Walmart, onto Cemetery Road. They pulled up to the Ashford estate and sat in the car, staring at the mansion. Their mansion, legally if not yet publicly accepted as such. What are we doing? Margaret asked quietly. Harold didn't answer right away. I don't know, he finally admitted. I thought this would solve our problems, pay off the medical bills, give us some breathing room. But instead we're fighting lawyers and reporters and angry neighbors. Our own town is turning against us. Margaret thought about the vault beneath the library floor, about paintings worth tens of millions, about stock certificates that had grown beyond imagination, about cash and coins and treasures that could change everything. And she thought about the cost, not in dollars but in peace, in privacy, in the quiet life they'd lived for 46 years of marriage. Harold, she said slowly, what if we don't keep it? He turned to look at her. What? What if we don't keep all of it? What James wrote in his letter. He said not to let greed consume us. He said to let some good come of it. She gestured toward the mansion. We don't need $290 million. We need $50,000 to pay our bills. Maybe a little more to be comfortable. But the rest... Harold was quiet for a long time. You want to give it away? I want to do what James wanted. He didn't want vultures picking at his life's work. He wanted it to help people. That's what he wrote. Help others the way I wish I could have helped my son. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. We could help people, Harold. Really help them. The whole town. Maybe the whole county. They're treating us like criminals, Harold said. Like we stole something. Why would we help people who are turning their backs on us? Because James would have, Margaret replied. He lost everything, his son, his wife, but he still tried to do something good. He just ran out of time. She reached over and took Harold's hand. We have time. We can finish what he started. They sat in the car as the sun moved across the sky, both of them thinking. About James Ashford. About Thomas who never came home from Vietnam. About Catherine who died of a broken heart. About a fortune built to fill an emptiness that couldn't be filled. Finally, Harold spoke. If we do this, if we give most of it away, we do it right. We set up something permanent, something that lasts, not just writing checks to whoever asks. A foundation, Margaret said. Like James wrote about in his notes. We found papers in the vault. He'd been planning something before he died. A charitable trust. He just never finished it. Harold nodded slowly. We finish it for him. We keep enough to take care of ourselves, pay off our debts, be comfortable. And the rest, we use it the way he wanted, to help people. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. For the first time since they'd opened that vault, she could breathe properly. Yes, she said, that's what we do. They told Sarah their decision the next morning. She listened carefully, making notes. It's generous, she said when they finished explaining. Maybe too generous. You understand you'd be giving away a fortune. We understand, Margaret replied. But we didn't earn it. We stumbled into it. and James Ashford left instructions, even if they weren't legally binding. He wanted the money to help people. Sarah studied them both. Okay, if you're sure we can do this, we'll establish a foundation. I'll need to bring in a tax specialist to structure it properly. We can name it after James Ashford, honor his memory. You'd serve as trustees, make decisions about how the money is distributed, and you can absolutely keep enough to secure your own future first. How much is enough? Harold asked. Sarah pulled out a calculator. Your debts are about 50,000. If we set aside 500,000 for you, that gives you a cushion. You could invest it conservatively, live off the interest, never worry about money again. Still leave well over 200 million for the foundation. Margaret thought about $500,000. 6 months ago, that amount would have seemed impossible. Now it felt almost modest compared to what they were giving away. But it was more than enough, more than they'd ever dreamed of having. That works, she said. Over the next week, Sarah worked to make it real. She brought in specialists, drafted paperwork, filed documents with the state. The foundation would be called the Ashford Legacy Fund. Its mission: to support education, healthcare, and community development in Cedar Springs and the surrounding county. But not everyone was happy about it. When word leaked that Margaret and Harold were planning to give most of the fortune away, the attacks intensified. People who'd been demanding they share now complained about how they were sharing. The county commissioners argued the foundation should be managed by the government, not two unqualified retirees. Some of the lawyers representing alleged Ashford relatives claimed Margaret and Harold were trying to hide assets. One particularly vicious editorial ran in the Cedar Springs Gazette, questioning whether Margaret and Harold were mentally competent to make such decisions. Are these elderly residents being manipulated? It asked. Or are they simply naive about the value of what they've found? Margaret read it at the kitchen table and felt something harden inside her. She'd spent 42 years helping this town, organizing reading programs for children, staying late to help students with research papers, fighting to keep the library open when budgets were cut. Harold had taught generations of kids, had given up his own time to help struggling students, had volunteered as a coach and mentor, and now they were being called incompetent. Harold found her crying over the newspaper. He sat down beside her and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. We're doing the right thing, he said quietly. You know that, right? Then why does it feel so hard? She asked. Because doing the right thing usually is. The investigation Sarah had warned about came next. County officials, accompanied by state authorities, wanted to inventory everything in the Ashford estate. They wanted independent appraisals. They wanted to verify that Margaret and Harold hadn't removed or sold anything. Margaret and Harold gave them full access, stood by while strangers walked through the mansion, through the vault, touching James Ashford's carefully preserved collection, assigning dollar values to his memories. The lead investigator, a stern woman named Karen Foster, spent 3 days examining everything. When she finished, she called Margaret and Harold in for what she termed an informational meeting. The initial appraisal, Karen said, reading from a tablet, puts the total value at approximately $287 million. That includes art, coins, stocks, precious metals, cash, and collectibles. Obviously, some items may appraise higher or lower when individually evaluated, but that's our working estimate. 287 million. Margaret had been close in her guess. We've verified the documents you provided, Karen continued. James Ashford's letter of intent appears legitimate. The notary's signature checks out. The deed transfer from the auction is proper. While the situation is highly unusual, we cannot find any legal irregularities. Margaret felt Harold's hand tighten on hers. However, Karen added, given the magnitude of the assets involved, the state tax authority will be conducting their own review, and the IRS has been notified. You should expect federal involvement. We're cooperating fully, Sarah said. She'd insisted on being present for the meeting. I can see that. Karen closed her tablet. Off the record, you two are handling this better than most people would. I've seen families destroy themselves fighting over far less money. The fact that you're planning to establish a charitable foundation that says something about your character. It was the first kind word anyone in an official capacity had said to them in weeks. Margaret felt tears threatening again. After the meeting, Sarah drove them back to their house. "This is good news," she said. "If the county can't find any impropriety, the legal challenges from supposed relatives will be much weaker." "When can we actually access the money?" Harold asked. "When can we start the foundation?" "We need the IRS review first, probably 2 to 3 months. Then we can begin liquidating assets in a structured way, selling the art pieces, converting the stocks, dealing with the precious metals. That will take time. Maybe a year to fully execute." Sarah pulled into their driveway. "But once we have even preliminary funds released, we can start operating the foundation, start helping people." Margaret looked at their small house, at the bills probably waiting inside, at the life they'd known before an auction on a Saturday morning changed everything. "We can wait," she said. "We've waited this long." That evening, sitting on their worn couch, Harold asked the question Margaret had been thinking about. "Do you regret it? Going to that auction? Buying the mansion?" Margaret considered carefully. Their lives had been turned upside down, their privacy invaded, their characters questioned. They'd been attacked in the newspaper, threatened with lawsuits, investigated by multiple government agencies. But they'd also discovered something remarkable. Not just a fortune, but a story. James Ashford's story. A man who'd lost everything but tried to leave something beautiful behind. A man who'd trusted that someday someone would find his gift and use it wisely. "No," she finally said, "I don't regret it. It's been hard. Harder than I imagined. But we're going to do something good. Something that lasts, that matters more than comfort." Harold pulled her close. "We're going to name a scholarship after Thomas, for kids who want to study architecture. Make sure his dream lives on somehow. And a medical fund after Catherine," Margaret added, "to help people who can't afford treatment, so no one else has to die of a broken heart because they can't afford care." They sat together in the quiet of their small house, planning how to give away more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, planning how to honor a family they'd never met, planning how to turn a tragic story into something hopeful. Outside, the neighbor's dog barked. A car drove past. Life in Cedar Springs continued, unaware that 2 of its own were about to change it forever. For better or worse, that remained to be seen. But Margaret and Harold Davies, married for 46 years, struggling to pay their bills, were ready to find out. They'd found a fortune. Now they'd find out what it cost. Not in dollars, but in courage, in character, in their willingness to put others first when the entire world was telling them to take care of themselves. James Ashford had written that he wanted someone who found his collection through need, not greed. Margaret and Harold had needed it, but they chose not to be greedy. And that choice, more than the fortune itself, would define everything that came next. 3 months passed like trudging through mud. The IRS review took longer than Sarah predicted. Federal agents combed through every document, every receipt, every stock certificate. They interviewed Margaret and Harold separately, asking the same questions different ways, looking for inconsistencies that didn't exist. Margaret sat across from Agent Thomas Riley in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and suspicion. He was in his 40s, tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, manila folders stacked in front of him. "Walk me through it again," he said. "You had no prior knowledge of what was in the Ashford estate before purchasing it?" "None," Margaret replied for the 3rd time. "We bought it hoping to flip it, pay some medical bills, that's all." "And you expect me to believe you just stumbled onto $287 million? Margaret met his eyes steadily. "I expect you to do your job. which is verify that we're telling the truth, which we are." Agent Riley studied her for a long moment, then closed his folder. "You know what's strange about this case, Mrs. Davies? In 22 years with the IRS, I've investigated hundreds of people trying to hide money, dodge taxes, cheat the system. They all have tells. Nervousness, inconsistent stories, paper trails that don't add up." He leaned back. "You and your husband? Your stories match perfectly. Your financial history is clean, and you're voluntarily giving away 90% of a fortune you legally own. I've never seen anything like it." "Is that a problem?" Margaret asked. "No," he said. "It's just unusual. People don't do things like this." "Maybe they should," Margaret replied quietly. By February, the IRS completed their review. No irregularities found. The estate was legally Margaret and Harold's. The plan to establish a charitable foundation was approved. They could proceed. Sarah called them on a Wednesday morning. "It's done. We're clear. We can start liquidating assets and funding the Ashford Legacy Fund." Margaret felt relief wash over her like warm water. "When can we start helping people?" "As soon as we have liquid capital. I've been working with auction houses for the art pieces. Christie's wants the Monet. Sotheby's is interested in several others. We could have 10 to 15 million available within 60 days. $10 to $15 million to start, with more coming as stocks were sold, coins auctioned, other assets converted to cash." Margaret's head spun, trying to comprehend it. The first painting sold at auction 3 weeks later. The Monet, Water Lilies, 1908. The bidding started at $12 million. It sold for $43 million. Margaret and Harold watched the live stream from Sarah's office, watching the price climb higher and higher until the final hammer fell. $43 million. For one painting. Harold's hands were shaking. "That's more money than everyone in Cedar Springs combined makes in a year." "And it's going to help them," Sarah reminded him. "That's what matters." The money transferred to the foundation's account within a week. After taxes, fees, and auction costs, $31 million sat waiting to be used for good. Sarah had already begun processing applications for grants and assistance. Word had spread that the Ashford Legacy Fund was real, was funded, was ready to help. The requests poured in, hundreds of them. Some legitimate needs, some scams, some heartbreaking stories that Margaret read with tears streaming down her face. A young veteran, 24 years old, who'd lost his leg in Afghanistan and couldn't afford the prosthetic that would let him walk again. Cost $67,000. A retired teacher, 81, whose pension barely covered her medications, choosing between pills and food each month. Needed $2,000 a month. A family whose house had burned down, insurance lapsed, 3 kids sleeping in their car. Needed down payment on an apartment and first month's rent. $8,000. Margaret and Harold sat at their kitchen table, now covered with applications instead of bills, and made decisions that changed lives. "The veteran gets his prosthetic," Harold said, "fully funded, and we pay for his physical therapy too." "The teacher," Margaret added, "we set up a monthly payment to cover all her medications for as long as she lives." "The family with 3 kids, we don't just give them $8,000, we buy them a house, outright." Harold looked up. "Can we do that?" Sarah, who was working with them daily now, nodded. "We can do whatever you want. You have $31 million to work with currently, and more coming. You could buy a house for every homeless family in the county." They didn't buy houses for everyone. They were strategic, careful, guided by James Ashford's careful planning they'd found in his notes. Education, healthcare, community development. Those were the pillars. The first major project was announced in March. The Ashford Legacy Fund would fully renovate Cedar Springs Public Library, the place Margaret had dedicated 42 years of her life. New computers, new books. A children's reading room with comfortable furniture and bright colors. disability access, climate control to protect the collection. Estimated cost, $1,200,000. The library board was stunned. The town council had been trying to scrape together $50,000 for basic repairs for 3 years. Now Margaret walked in and handed them a check for over $1 million. The library director, a young woman named Jennifer, who'd taken over after Margaret retired, broke down crying. "Do you know what this means? We can actually serve the community properly. Kids who don't have internet at home can do homework. Elderly people can access services. We can be what a library should be." Margaret hugged her tightly. "That's all I ever wanted." The second project hit even closer to Harold's heart. The Cedar Springs High School shop program, where he'd taught for 38 years, had been gutted by budget cuts. The equipment was ancient, dangerous. Most of it didn't work. Kids weren't learning proper skills because there were no tools to learn with. The Ashford Legacy Fund donated $2 million to completely rebuild the program. New equipment, updated safety features, enough materials that teachers wouldn't have to beg students to buy their own wood and metal, and a scholarship program, the Thomas Ashford Memorial Scholarship for students pursuing careers in architecture, engineering, or skilled trades. Full ride to vocational school or college. 20 scholarships a year. When Harold walked into the renovated shop classroom for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, he stopped in the doorway and just stared. Brand new lathes, drill presses, sanders, safety equipment, ventilation systems. Everything he'd ever wanted when he was teaching, but never had the budget for. The current shop teacher, a man in his 30s named Marcus, shook Harold's hand. "Mr. Davies, this is incredible. We can actually teach properly now. Kids can learn real skills that will get them real jobs." "That's what James Ashford wanted," Harold said quietly. "His son Thomas wanted to build things, wanted to create. This honors that." The scholarship announcement brought students Harold had taught decades ago out of the woodwork. Men and women in their 40s and 50s, many of them now contractors, engineers, craftspeople, who remembered Harold staying late to help them with projects, who credited him with their success. At the ceremony, a man named David stood up. Harold recognized him immediately. David Harris, class of 1993, barely passed his classes, struggled with reading, but could build anything with his hands. "Mr. Davies spent hours with me after school," David said to the crowd. "I was going to drop out. My dad said school was a waste. I should get a job. But Mr. Davies saw something in me. Taught me I was smart, just in a different way. Now I own a construction company with 23 employees. I wouldn't be here without him." His voice cracked. "This scholarship, it's going to give kids like I was a real chance. Thank you for that." Harold couldn't speak. Margaret squeezed his hand as the auditorium erupted in applause. The medical fund launched in April. The Catherine Ashford Memorial Healthcare Fund would cover medical expenses for Cedar Springs residents who couldn't afford treatment. Doctor visits, medications, surgeries, cancer treatments, anything that kept people healthy or alive. The fund partnered with the local hospital, setting up a system where patients could apply for assistance. No credit checks, no income verification meant to shame people. Just need. If you needed help, you got it. Within the first month, 147 people received assistance. Total cost, $382,000. People who'd been rationing insulin could afford proper doses. A woman who'd delayed a necessary surgery for 2 years because she couldn't afford it finally got treatment. A child with severe allergies got the EpiPen that could save his life. Margaret visited the hospital to see how the program was working. A nurse pulled her aside. "You need to meet someone," the nurse said. She led Margaret to a room where an elderly woman sat in a chair by the window. She was thin, pale, but smiling. An IV ran into her arm, delivering chemotherapy. "Mrs. Davies," the nurse said, "this is Patricia Morgan. She has stage 3 breast cancer. Without the Ashford Fund, she couldn't afford treatment. She was going home to die." Patricia looked up at Margaret with watery blue eyes. "I prayed," she said, her voice weak. "I prayed for a miracle, and you showed up. You and your husband, you're my miracle." Margaret sat down beside her and took her hand. She didn't trust herself to speak, just held this stranger's hand while she received medicine that might save her life. Medicine paid for by a fortune found hidden in a mansion. "Your husband taught my grandson," Patricia continued. "Tommy. He's going to college now on that scholarship you set up, studying to be an architect." She smiled. "You're saving my life and changing his. How do I even thank you for that?" "You don't," Margaret whispered. "You just get better. You just live." By June, the Ashford estate itself was being transformed. Margaret and Harold had decided not to sell it. Instead, they'd turn it into the foundation's headquarters and a community centre. The mansion would be restored to its former glory and opened to the public. Contractors worked carefully, preserving James Ashford's original vision while making the building functional. The grand foyer became a welcome centre. The formal dining room, a community meeting space. The parlour, an art gallery featuring rotating exhibits, some from James's collection, others from local artists. The library remained largely untouched. James's books stayed on the shelves, available for researchers and visitors. His desk, his papers, his photographs, all carefully preserved. One wall was dedicated to his story: James and Catherine's wedding photo, Thomas in his military uniform, newspaper clippings about the Ashford family business. And James's letter, framed and mounted, explaining why he'd hidden his fortune and what he'd hoped would happen when someone found it. The vault became a museum. The climate-controlled room where James had stored his most precious items now displayed them for the public. Paintings rotated to auction houses for sale, but photographs showed what had been there. The coin collection reduced but still impressive. Some of Catherine's jewellery, never to be sold, preserved as examples of fine craftsmanship from another era. A placard explained it all. James Robert Ashford spent his final years collecting beauty because he'd lost what mattered most. He hoped his collection would someday help others. Thanks to Margaret and Harold Davies, his hope became reality. The grand opening was planned for September, 18 months after that first Saturday morning auction. Invitations went out across the county, local officials, donors, people who'd been helped by the fund. The curious. Anyone who wanted to see what had become of the mansion that had sat abandoned for 41 years. Margaret spent the morning of the opening getting ready. She wore a new dress, the first one she'd bought in years, navy blue with small white flowers. Harold wore a suit that actually fit, not the too tight one he'd worn to meetings. They drove to the mansion together, just like they had that first morning. But the driveway had been repaired. The gardens had been restored, the fountain ran clear water, and the mansion itself gleamed, stone cleaned, windows replaced, ivy trimmed back to reveal the beautiful architecture underneath. Cars filled the circular drive and lined Cemetery Road. Hundreds of people had come. Sarah met them at the door. "You ready?" she asked. Margaret looked at Harold. They both nodded. Inside, the foyer was packed. People Margaret had known her whole life. Students Harold had taught. Strangers whose lives had been changed by the Ashford Fund. Reporters. Officials. All waiting. The mayor of Cedar Springs, an older man named Richard, who'd been skeptical of the whole thing at first, called for attention. "When Margaret and Harold Davies bought this property," he began, "some people questioned it. I'll be honest, I was one of them. I wondered what two retirees wanted with an abandoned mansion. I worried about their judgment." He paused. "I was wrong, and I'm man enough to admit it." He turned to face Margaret and Harold. "What you've done here, what you continue to do through the Ashford Legacy Fund, it's remarkable. In less than a year, you've helped over 600 families. You've funded scholarships for 83 students. You've paid medical bills that would have bankrupted people. You've renovated the library, the school, the community centre. You've given Cedar Springs hope." Applause filled the foyer, echoing off the marble floors and crystal chandelier. "But more than that," Richard continued, "you've shown us something about character, about what it means to do the right thing even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. You could have kept this fortune. Legally, morally, you had every right to it, but you chose to share it, to honor a man you never met by finishing what he started. That's legacy. That's what matters." More applause. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. Harold's arm was around her shoulders, holding her steady. The mayor unveiled a plaque beside the front door. The Ashford Legacy Centre, established 2024 in memory of James, Catherine and Thomas Ashford, through the generosity of Margaret and Harold Davies, may this place forever serve those in need and preserve the beauty of what human hands can create. Tours began. People walked through the rooms, marveling at the restoration. Children ran carefully supervised fingers along the bookshelves in the library. Veterans stood silently in front of Thomas's military photo, many of them crying. Elderly residents who remembered the Ashford family when they were alive shared stories about James's kindness, Catherine's beauty, Thomas's promise. Margaret found herself in the Vault Museum, standing in front of the display about James's collection. A young girl, maybe 10, was reading the placard carefully. "Did you know him?" the girl asked, looking up at Margaret. "The man who lived here?" "No," Margaret said, "but I feel like I do. Through his letters, his collections, the care he took with everything. He was someone who loved beautiful things, who wanted them to last." "My mom says you gave away all his money," the girl said. "Is that true?" Margaret smiled. "Not all of it, but most of it, because that's what he wanted. He wanted it to help people." "That's nice," the girl said. Then, with the brutal honesty of children, "Are you rich now?" Margaret laughed. "We're comfortable. We can pay our bills. We don't worry about money anymore. But we're not rich. The foundation is rich, and that means everyone it helps is a little richer too." The girl nodded like this made perfect sense, then ran off to find her parents. Harold appeared at Margaret's elbow. "You doing okay?" "Yeah," she said. "Better than okay. This feels right." They walked through the mansion together, watching people explore, listening to conversations. In the art gallery, a couple stood in front of one of the remaining paintings from James's collection, a landscape by a lesser-known American artist from the early 1900s. "It's beautiful," the woman said. "Sad that he kept all this locked away for so long." "Maybe he didn't know what else to do with it," her companion replied. "Sometimes the only way to protect something is to hide it, until the right people come along." Margaret and Harold exchanged a look. Maybe that was exactly what had happened. James had protected his collection until the right people came along. People who understood that beauty wasn't for hoarding, that wealth wasn't for accumulating, that the things we leave behind matter less than what we do with them while we're here. The celebration continued into the evening. A string quartet played in the parlor. Food was served in the formal dining room catered by local restaurants, all of whom donated their services. The gardens were lit with tiny white lights, making the whole property look magical. As the sun set, Margaret and Harold found themselves alone for a moment on the back terrace. They could hear music and laughter from inside, could see people through the tall windows, enjoying the space, appreciating what had been created. "We did it," Harold said quietly. "Finished what James started." Margaret leaned against him. "Do you think he knows, somehow?" "I don't know," Harold admitted. "But I think Thomas would be proud. A scholarship in his name, helping kids pursue their dreams. And Catherine, knowing people are getting medical care because of her. That has to count for something." They stood in comfortable silence, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. 18 months ago, they'd been sitting at their kitchen table, drowning in bills, wondering if they'd have to sell their home. Now they stood in a mansion worth millions, having given away a fortune, having changed hundreds of lives. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't gone to that auction?" Margaret asked. Harold considered. "We'd probably still be struggling, still wondering how to make ends meet, still scared of the future. And James's collection would still be hidden, rotting away slowly. All that beauty, all those resources, helping no one." "Everything happens for a reason," Harold said. "Or at least we like to think it does. Maybe we were meant to find it, meant to be the kind of people who do the right thing with it." Margaret thought about character, about the choices that defined a life. They could have kept it all, could have lived in luxury for the rest of their days. Some people would say they were foolish for giving it away, crazy for choosing community over comfort. But standing here, listening to laughter from people whose lives had been changed, knowing that Thomas's name would live on through scholarships, that Catherine's memory honored people with healing, that James's beautiful collection would inspire generations, Margaret knew they'd made the right choice. Inside, someone called for attention. Sarah was standing in the foyer holding a glass of champagne. "One more thing before the evening ends," she announced. "Margaret and Harold Davies have asked me to share some news about the Foundation's future plans." Margaret and Harold rejoined the crowd. Sarah continued, "The Ashford Legacy Fund has been so successful that we're expanding. We're establishing satellite programs in 3 neighboring counties. We're creating an endowment that will fund operations in perpetuity, and we're launching a training program for other communities who want to create similar foundations. The Ashford model, caring for those in need while honoring the past, can be replicated anywhere." She raised her glass. "To James Ashford, who had a vision, to Margaret and Harold Davies, who brought it to life, and to all of us who benefit from their remarkable generosity and character." Glasses clinked. People cheered. And Margaret, who'd spent her life quietly helping others through her work at the library, who'd never sought recognition or praise, felt something settle deep in her chest. Peace, purpose. The knowledge that their lives, which had seemed small and ordinary, had become part of something much larger. The guests left slowly, reluctantly, as if leaving would break the spell. By 10 p.m., only Sarah, Margaret, and Harold remained. They walked through the mansion one final time, turning off lights, checking doors. In the library, Margaret stopped at James's desk. She picked up the framed photo of him and Catherine on their wedding day, young and hopeful, with no idea what tragedies awaited them. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting us, for leaving something beautiful behind." Harold came up beside her. "You think he knew, when he wrote that letter, when he hid everything, that someday 2 people like us would find it?" "I think he hoped," Margaret replied, "and hope was all he had left, so he preserved everything, documented everything, set up the legal framework, and he hoped. That's all any of us can do." They locked the mansion and drove home to their small house on Maple Street. It looked exactly the same as it had 18 months ago. Same peeling paint, same creaky steps. But everything was different now. Inside, the kitchen table no longer held bills. Instead, Margaret's laptop sat open to the Foundation's website, showing real-time updates on grants being processed, lives being changed, hope being restored. They could have moved, could have bought a bigger house, a newer car, anything they wanted. But this was home. This was where they'd built their life together. A bigger house wouldn't make them happier. Margaret made tea while Harold checked the news. The opening had made regional headlines. Local couple turns hidden fortune into community lifeline. "Listen to this," Harold said, reading from his phone. "In an era of increasing wealth inequality and declining community support, Margaret and Harold Davies represent something rare. People who put others before themselves. Their decision to establish the Ashford Legacy Fund instead of keeping the fortune they legally owned has transformed Cedar Springs and serves as a model for communities nationwide. As one recipient put it, they didn't just find money, they found purpose. Margaret smiled. That's exactly right. We found purpose. They went to bed early, both exhausted from the long day. But Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, thinking about James Ashford alone in that mansion, about Thomas, who never came home, about Catherine, whose heart couldn't survive the loss. And she thought about the letter James had written, the one that had guided everything. Help others the way I wish I could have helped my son. Thomas was beyond help, gone at 30 years old, buried in Arlington, his architectural dreams unfulfilled. But through the scholarship bearing his name, other young people would get the chance he never had. Would design buildings, create spaces, shape the world he never got to shape. That was legacy. Not money or property or things. Legacy was what continued after you were gone, the lives you touched, the good you enabled, the hope you created. Margaret and Harold Davies had stumbled into a fortune, but they'd chosen to turn it into something that mattered. And that choice, more than the money itself, defined who they were. Months turned into years. The Ashford Legacy Fund grew. More paintings sold at auction. Stocks were liquidated. The foundation's endowment reached $170 million, generating enough annual interest to fund operations without touching the principal. Scholarships sent hundreds of students to college. The medical fund saved countless lives. Community development grants renovated parks, built playgrounds, created jobs. Cedar Springs, which had been dying slowly for decades, came back to life. Young families moved in, attracted by the improving schools and available services. Businesses opened. The downtown, which had been half-empty storefronts, filled with shops and restaurants. Property values increased. The tax base grew. The positive cycle James Ashford had hoped for was happening. Margaret and Harold aged gracefully. Their health, no longer stressed by financial worry, remained good. They traveled some, took that trip to Vermont to see the fall colors, visited their daughter in Oregon more often. But they always came home to Cedar Springs, to the small house on Maple Street, to the foundation that had become their life's work. They served as trustees of the Ashford Fund, meeting weekly to review applications and make decisions. They attended every scholarship award ceremony, every ribbon cutting for projects they funded, every event at the Ashford Legacy Center. And people no longer whispered behind their backs or questioned their judgment. Instead, children learned about them in school. The elderly blessed them in prayers. The struggling thanked them through tears. 5 years after that first auction, on a quiet October morning, much like the one when they'd bought the mansion, Margaret and Harold sat on the restored terrace of the Ashford estate. They were older now, Harold 76, Margaret 73, but still sharp, still engaged, still committed. A young man approached nervously. He was in his mid-20s, dressed in a suit that looked new, carrying a portfolio. "Mr. and Mrs. Davies?" he asked. "I'm Tyler Hoffman. I don't know if you remember me." Harold studied his face. "Tyler, you were in my shop class. Must have been, 2008, 2009? 2010, Tyler confirmed. "I was the kid who couldn't afford materials. You bought me wood out of your own pocket so I could complete my projects." "I remember," Harold said. "You were talented, had a good eye for design." Tyler's face lit up. "I got the Thomas Ashford Scholarship, full ride to State University. I just graduated with a degree in architecture. I started a firm in Indianapolis next month." He opened his portfolio. "I brought you something." Inside was a rendering, beautifully detailed, of a building. It took Margaret a moment to recognize it. The Ashford estate, but imagined as it might look 50 years in the future. Expanded, modernized, but still maintaining its essential character. "It's my thesis project," Tyler explained. "Designing a community center that honors the past while serving the future. I used the Ashford Legacy Center as my model, because that's what inspired me. What you and Mr. Ashford created here. A place where history and hope meet." Harold's eyes were wet. "This is beautiful, son." "It's more than that," Tyler said. "It's my thank you. Without you and Mrs. Davies, I'd be working construction. Nothing wrong with that, but it wasn't my dream. You gave me my dream. I wanted you to know that." After Tyler left, Margaret and Harold sat quietly, looking out over the gardens. "That," Harold finally said, "that's why we did this." Margaret nodded. She was thinking about all the Tylers out there, the students pursuing dreams they couldn't afford, the patients getting treatment they couldn't pay for, the families finding stability they couldn't achieve alone. Hundreds of lives changed, thousands more to come. James Ashford had written in his letter that he wished he could have helped his son. He couldn't. Thomas was gone. But through the fortune he'd left and the people he'd trusted to find it, James was helping thousands of other sons and daughters, giving them chances, opening doors, creating possibilities. Legacy wasn't about how much you accumulated, it was about what you did with it. And James, through Margaret and Harold, had created a legacy that would outlast them all. As the sun moved across the sky, Margaret thought about character, about the choices that defined a life. She and Harold had been given an impossible decision: keep a fortune or give it away. They'd chosen generosity over greed, community over comfort, purpose over profit. And in doing so, they'd discovered something more valuable than money. They'd found meaning, found a way to matter, found proof that ordinary people, through extraordinary choices, could change the world. The Ashford estate, once abandoned and forgotten, now rang with life. The vaults that had held secrets now held stories of transformation. The walls that had witnessed tragedy now witnessed hope. And somewhere, Margaret liked to imagine, James and Catherine and Thomas Ashford were watching, were proud, were finally at peace, knowing that their story, their fortune, their dreams hadn't died with them. They'd found new life, new purpose, new meaning. Because legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what continues after you're gone. And the Ashford legacy, carried forward by two people who stumbled into it and chose to honor it, would continue for generations. Anyone can find treasure if they're lucky, but it takes character to use it wisely, courage to share it generously, and wisdom to understand that the greatest wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in lives changed and hope restored. As evening fell over Cedar Springs, Margaret and Harold Davies walked hand in hand through the gardens they'd helped restore, past the mansion they'd helped save, toward the parking lot where their old Honda Civic waited. They'd never upgraded to a newer car, didn't need to. What they had was enough. And that, they'd learned, was the secret James Ashford had tried to teach them all along. Enough wasn't about accumulation. It was about gratitude, about recognizing when you had what you needed, and using anything beyond that to help others who were still searching. They'd bought a mansion for $375 and found inside it $290 million. But the real treasure wasn't the money. It was the purpose it gave them, the lives it let them touch, the legacy they'd helped build. For Margaret and Harold Davies, two ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, that was worth more than all the paintings and coins and stocks in the world. That was wealth that would never depreciate, never lose value, never run out. That was the kind of fortune that lasted forever. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the truth deserves a voice and that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose character over comfort and generosity over greed.